The morning fog hung heavy over Hillcrest Memorial Gardens as black limousines wound their way through the wrought iron gates. Harrison Whitmore, patriarch of the Whitmore business empire, lay in rest beneath a canopy of white roses that cost more than most people earned in a year. The funeral drew nearly 300 mourners, though Elena Vasquez suspected half of them were there more for the networking opportunities than genuine grief. Elena stood at the very back of the gathering, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the designer mourning attire that surrounded her. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible at family events. It was easier that way, less painful than enduring the cutting remarks and dismissive glances that seemed to follow her wherever the Whitmore clan assembled. Before we continue with this story of hidden strength and ultimate vindication, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? I find that the most powerful revenge stories often come from places where people understand what it means to be underestimated. Drop a comment with your location and tell me if you've ever been in a situation where people completely misjudged what you were capable of. Victoria Whitmore Sterling, the eldest daughter and self-appointed family spokesperson, stood near the front with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and pearls that could have funded a small business. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Elena had never once seen Victoria cry genuine tears for her father. Next to her, Charles Whitmore adjusted his platinum cufflinks and checked his phone, already calculating how the inheritance would affect his quarterly projections. Elena's husband David fidgeted beside her, tugging at his tie with nervous energy. As the youngest Whitmore son, David had never quite measured up to his family's expectations. Where Charles had Harvard MBA and Victoria had inherited their mother's social connections, David had chosen art school and married a woman his family considered beneath their station. Margaret Whitmore Cross, the middle daughter, whispered loudly to her husband about the funeral arrangements. She always spoke just loudly enough for others to overhear, especially when making pointed observations. Today her target seemed to be the floral arrangements, though Elena caught the subtle glances in her direction and knew the real subject of conversation. The minister began his eulogy, painting Harrison as a devoted family man and philanthropist. Elena almost smiled at that. Harrison had been many things: brilliant businessman, demanding father, complicated man with hidden depths, but devoted family man was stretching the truth considerably. She had spent enough quiet afternoons listening to his stories to know the real Harrison, the one who regretted the distance he had maintained from his children in pursuit of building his empire. As the service progressed, Elena found herself studying the faces around her. Victoria's husband Sterling maintained his politician's smile, already thinking about the campaign donations that might flow from Harrison's business contacts. Charles's wife Patricia kept adjusting her jewelry, making sure the cameras captured her best angles for the society pages that would surely cover the funeral extensively. The extended family filled several rows, cousins and second cousins who rarely visited when Harrison was alive, but had materialized like moths to a flame once news of his illness became public knowledge. Elena recognized the calculating expressions, the same looks she had seen at family Christmas dinners when conversations inevitably turned to business valuations and estate planning. David's hand found hers during the closing prayer, squeezing gently. He was trying to offer comfort, but she could feel the tremor in his grip. David knew what was coming after the funeral. They all did. The will reading was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and the vultures were already circling. After the service, family members clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about arrangements and logistics. Elena busied herself collecting forgotten programs and straightening chairs, playing the role they expected of her. The helpful daughter-in-law who knew her place and didn't presume to insert herself into important family discussions. Victoria approached with her practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Elena, dear," she said in her honey-coated voice, "would you mind terribly helping coordinate the catering for the reception? The staff seems overwhelmed, and you have such a knack for managing domestic details." "Of course," Elena replied quietly, already knowing this was less request than command. She had learned years ago that resistance only invited more pointed reminders of her position in the family hierarchy. As she walked toward the catering stations, Elena caught fragments of conversation from Charles and his business associates. Something about overseas investments and tax implications, discussed with the casual confidence of people who had never had to worry about money. Behind her, she heard Patricia's laugh, sharp and artificial, followed by a comment about knowing one's limitations. The reception hall at the country club buzzed with activity as Elena quietly ensured everything ran smoothly. She directed servers, coordinated with the kitchen staff, and managed the small crises that always emerged at large gatherings. All the while, she remained invisible to the family members who benefited from her efforts. Margaret cornered her near the dessert table, feigning concern as she delivered her latest assessment. "Elena, sweetheart, you look absolutely exhausted. All this stress must be so overwhelming for someone who is not accustomed to handling affairs of this magnitude. Perhaps you should consider taking some time away after everything is settled." Elena nodded politely, recognizing the suggestion for what it really was. Margaret was already assuming Elena would be removed from the family equation once the inheritance matters were resolved. The assumption that she would simply fade away, taking David with her back to whatever modest life they could manage without Whitmore money. As the afternoon wore on, Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost, observing everything while seeming to notice nothing. She watched Victoria work the room, collecting business cards and scheduling lunch meetings with potential investors. She noted Charles deep in conversation with the family attorney, their heads bent together over what appeared to be legal documents. The attorney, Jonathan Blackwood, was a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled Whitmore family legal matters for decades. Elena had met him several times at family functions, though he had never bothered to engage her in conversation beyond polite pleasantries. Today, however, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. David appeared at her side as the reception began winding down, looking drained from hours of accepting condolences and deflecting questions about the future of the family business. His siblings had made it clear that his role in company operations would be minimal at best, assuming he maintained any role at all. "We should probably head home," he murmured, glancing around nervously as if afraid his family might overhear and object to their early departure. They did not object. In fact, Elena suspected they barely noticed when she and David quietly slipped out through the side entrance. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Elena gazed out the window at the sprawling estates that lined the winding road, each one representing the kind of generational wealth that built dynasties and destroyed families with equal efficiency. Tomorrow would bring the will reading, and with it the formal dissolution of whatever tenuous position she had maintained within the Whitmore family structure. Victoria had already made subtle inquiries about David's plans, suggestions wrapped in concern, but carrying the clear message that his continued dependence on family resources might not be sustainable long-term. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, a far cry from the family estate where David had grown up, Elena felt a familiar sense of calm settling over her. Let them have their assumptions and their plans. Let them continue to see her as nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of David's poor judgment and lack of ambition. Tomorrow they would learn just how wrong they had been about so many things. But tonight, Elena Vasquez sat in her quiet living room, opened her laptop, and reviewed the documents she had been preparing for this moment for the past 15 years. The game was about to begin, and for once, she would not be playing defense. The law offices of Blackwood, Hartwell and Associates occupied 3 floors of downtown's most prestigious financial district tower. Elena had never been inside the building before, though she had driven past it countless times during her years of marriage to David. The marble lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and even the elevator buttons were polished brass that reflected the faces of the Whitmore family members as they ascended to the 32nd floor in tense silence. Victoria emerged from the elevator first, her heels clicking authoritatively across the hardwood floors as she surveyed the conference room like a general inspecting her battlefield. The room was everything one would expect from a firm that had managed old money for generations. Dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound legal volumes lining the walls, and a conference table that could easily seat 20 people comfortably. Charles followed closely behind, his eyes immediately cataloging the expensive artwork and antique furnishings. Even in grief, or what passed for grief in the Whitmore family, he maintained his businessman's habit of assessing value and calculating worth. Patricia clung to his arm, her designer handbag clutched tightly, as if someone might snatch it away at any moment. Margaret swept into the room with theatrical flair, her black dress perfectly chosen to convey mourning while still highlighting her figure. Her husband Thomas trailed behind, checking his phone for stock market updates and looking vaguely annoyed at having to interrupt his day for family obligations. Elena entered last with David, both of them hanging back as the others claimed their positions around the table. Victoria immediately took the chair at the head of the table opposite where the attorney would sit, a power move that surprised no one who knew her. Charles positioned himself to her right, while Margaret claimed the left side, creating a triumvirate of authority that had dominated family dynamics for decades. Without being asked, Elena moved toward the back of the room where several chairs had been arranged for what were clearly considered secondary attendees. David hesitated for a moment, torn between joining his siblings at the main table and staying with his wife, before ultimately following Elena to the less prominent seating area. The attorney's assistant, an efficient-looking woman in her 50s, distributed bottles of water and legal pads to each attendee. She offered Elena a polite smile, the first genuine warmth anyone had shown her since arriving at the building. The small gesture did not go unnoticed by Victoria, who raised an eyebrow at what she clearly considered inappropriate familiarity with hired help. Jonathan Blackwood entered the room carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than some of the furniture. He moved with the measured dignity of a man who had presided over the transfer of generational wealth for nearly 4 decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccably tailored, and his presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Good morning, everyone," he said in his carefully modulated voice. "I want to thank you all for gathering here today during what I know is a difficult time. Harrison was not only a client, but a personal friend, and I am honored to execute his final wishes according to his very detailed instructions." He opened his briefcase with deliberate care, removing several thick documents and arranging them on the table with precise attention to order. Elena noticed that one envelope remained separate from the others, thicker than the rest, and sealed with what appeared to be red wax. "Before we begin with the formal reading," Blackwood continued, "I want to acknowledge that Harrison spent considerable time over the past several years ensuring that his wishes were clearly documented and legally sound. He was very specific about the order in which information should be revealed and the manner in which certain provisions should be explained." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "We appreciate your thoroughness, Jonathan. I am sure we all want to honor Father's wishes exactly as he intended them." Charles nodded in agreement, though his fingers drummed impatiently on the mahogany surface. "The quarterly board meeting is next week," he added. "It would be helpful to have clarity on the business succession issues as soon as possible." "Of course," Blackwood replied smoothly. "However, I must ask for your patience as we work through the document systematically." Harrison was very insistent that nothing be rushed or summarized. Every provision must be read in full and in the proper sequence. He lifted the first document, adjusting his reading glasses with practiced ease. The last will and testament of Harrison Mitchell Whitmore, dated March 15th of this year, superseding all previous wills and codicils. Elena settled back in her chair, preparing for what she knew would be a lengthy process. She had attended enough family meetings to understand how these things worked in the Whitmore world. Everything had to be documented, witnessed, and executed with maximum formality to prevent any future challenges to the family's financial arrangements. The reading began with the standard legal language, establishing Harrison's sound mind and body at the time the will was created. Blackwood's voice took on the rhythmic cadence of someone who had read countless such documents, each phrase weighted with decades of legal precedent and careful consideration. As the preliminary sections continued, Elena found herself studying the faces around the room. Victoria maintained her composed expression, but the slight tension in her jaw betrayed her impatience with the formal proceedings. Margaret fidgeted with her jewelry, twisting her wedding ring in a nervous habit Elena had observed during stressful family gatherings. The first actual bequests were modest ones, gifts to longtime household staff and charitable organizations that had been important to Harrison during his lifetime. Blackwood read each one carefully, noting the specific amounts and any conditions attached to the donations. To Maria Santos, who provided faithful housekeeping services for 23 years, the sum of $50,000 and full medical benefits for life. To James Crawford, groundskeeper and driver, $50,000 and the use of the cottage on the east side of the property for as long as he desires. Elena smiled slightly at these provisions. Harrison had always been more generous with his staff than with his own family, perhaps because their loyalty had never come with conditions or expectations of inheritance. The household employees had genuinely cared for him, especially during his final illness when family visits had been sporadic at best. Charles shifted in his seat as the charitable bequests continued. $2 million to the Children's Hospital, $1 million to the scholarship fund at his alma mater, $500,000 to the local symphony orchestra. Substantial amounts by any measure, but still preliminary compared to what everyone knew was coming. Margaret whispered something to Thomas about tax implications, apparently concerned that charitable donations might reduce the overall estate value available for family distribution. Her comment was barely audible, but Elena caught the words and noted the calculation behind her sister-in-law's apparent concern for philanthropy. As the reading progressed through various smaller bequests and specific gifts of personal property, Elena noticed that Blackwood occasionally glanced in her direction. The looks were brief and could have been coincidental, but something in his expression suggested a deeper awareness of her presence than anyone else in the room seemed to possess. Victoria finally spoke up during a pause between sections. "Jonathan, while we certainly respect Father's charitable inclinations, could we perhaps move toward the primary estate provisions? There are business matters that require immediate attention, and I am sure everyone would appreciate understanding the overall structure." Blackwood set down the document he had been reading and looked directly at Victoria with an expression that managed to be both respectful and mildly reproving. "Victoria, I understand your urgency, but Harrison was very specific about the order of these proceedings. He wanted certain information presented before other revelations were made. I am obligated to follow his instructions precisely." The word revelations hung in the air with unexpected weight. Elena felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a subtle change in energy that suggested the careful script everyone thought they understood might contain some unexpected elements. Charles frowned at the attorney's choice of words. Revelation seems like an unusual term for what should be straightforward estate planning. Blackwood's smile was enigmatic as he returned to his documents. Harrison was an unusual man, as I think you all know. He believed that understanding the full context of his decisions was important for everyone involved. With that in mind, shall we continue? Elena found herself leaning forward slightly, her attention sharpening as something in the attorney's manner suggested that the predictable family gathering she had expected was about to become something entirely different. Around the table, the Whitmore siblings maintained their confident expressions, but she detected the first hints of uncertainty creeping into their posture. The game was about to begin in earnest, and Elena had the distinct impression that none of them, including herself, fully understood the rules Harrison had established for this final family meeting. Jonathan Blackwood cleared his throat and lifted a new section of documents, these noticeably thicker than the charitable bequests that had opened the proceedings. The family leaned forward with renewed attention as he adjusted his reading glasses and began what everyone understood would be the substantive portion of Harrison's final wishes. "We now come to the primary estate distributions," he announced in his measured tone. Harrison spent considerable time structuring these bequests to ensure both the preservation of family assets and the recognition of individual contributions and relationships. Victoria straightened in her chair, her composure perfect, but her eyes bright with anticipation. As the eldest daughter and the family member who had maintained the closest relationship with Harrison's business interests, she clearly expected to receive the lion's share of the inheritance. "To my daughter Victoria Whitmore Sterling," Blackwood read, "I leave the family residence at 1247 Magnolia Drive, including all furnishings, artwork, and personal effects contained therein, along with the adjacent 10 acres of grounds and all structures thereon." Victoria's smile was radiant as she absorbed this news. The family estate was worth several $1,000,000 and had been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations. Along with the property, she would inherit Harrison's extensive collection of rare books, antique furniture, and the paintings that had been acquired over decades of careful collecting. However, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a slightly more formal tone. This bequest comes with specific conditions. The property must remain in the family and cannot be sold for a period of no less than 25 years. Additionally, Victoria will be responsible for maintaining the property according to historical preservation standards and ensuring that family gatherings continue to be hosted there during major holidays. The conditions seemed reasonable enough, and Victoria nodded graciously. "Of course," she said, "I would never dream of selling the family home. It will be an honor to preserve Father's legacy and continue our family traditions." Charles was next, and Blackwood shuffled through several pages before finding the relevant section. "To my son Charles Mitchell Whitmore, I leave my investment portfolio, including all stocks, bonds, and securities currently managed by Rothschild Investment Group, with an estimated current value of $12 million. Charles actually smiled, a rare display of emotion from the usually reserved businessman. The investment portfolio represented Harrison's most liquid assets and would provide Charles with immediate access to substantial capital for his own business ventures. "This bequest also carries specific responsibilities," Blackwood continued. "Charles will serve as the family's primary financial advisor and will be responsible for managing investment strategies for various family trusts that will be established according to provisions outlined later in this document." Margaret received the family's vacation properties, including the ski lodge in Aspen and the beach house in the Hamptons, along with sufficient funds to maintain both properties in perpetuity. She practically glowed as Blackwood detailed the generous maintenance allowances that would ensure she could host elaborate parties and family gatherings at both locations. Each of these major bequests came with detailed instructions about preservation, family access, and long-term stewardship. Harrison had clearly spent considerable time ensuring that the family's wealth would remain consolidated and that his children would have both the means and the motivation to maintain their elevated social status. Elena watched the proceedings with quiet attention, noting how each sibling's inheritance perfectly matched their personalities and interests. Victoria received the prestige and social prominence of the family estate. Charles got liquid assets and financial control. Margaret was given the recreational properties that would allow her to continue her role as the family's social coordinator. David's name had not yet been mentioned, and Elena could feel his growing anxiety in the way he shifted in his chair and occasionally glanced toward his siblings' triumphant faces. As the youngest son who had disappointed family expectations by pursuing art instead of business, David had always known his inheritance would be more modest than his siblings. Sterling leaned over to whisper something in Victoria's ear, probably calculating the combined value of what the family had received so far. Patricia was already making notes on her phone, likely planning how Charles's newfound wealth might be leveraged for their own social advancement. Thomas seemed pleased with Margaret's inheritance, as the vacation properties would significantly enhance their lifestyle and provide excellent venues for entertaining his business associates. The family was clearly satisfied with Harrison's generosity and the thoughtful way he had structured their inheritances to maximize both immediate benefit and long-term family unity. Blackwood paused to organize another set of documents, and the room buzzed with quiet conversations as family members processed their good fortune. Elena remained silent in her corner, but she noticed that the attorney's assistant was watching her with an expression of barely contained anticipation. "To my youngest son, David Harrison Whitmore," Blackwood resumed, "I leave the sum of $2 million, to be held in trust with annual distributions sufficient to provide him with a comfortable living while encouraging the pursuit of his artistic endeavors." Elena felt David relax beside her as his inheritance was announced. $2 million was substantial by any normal measure, even if it paled in comparison to what his siblings had received. The trust structure would provide him with financial security while acknowledging Harrison's acceptance of his son's chosen career path. However, David's inheritance came with its own conditions. The trust will be administered by his siblings collectively, and any major expenditures must be approved by majority vote of Victoria, Charles, and Margaret. This provision is designed to ensure responsible financial management while providing appropriate family oversight. Elena saw David's face fall as he absorbed the implications of this arrangement. His inheritance, while generous, effectively placed him under the permanent financial supervision of siblings who had never respected his choices or supported his independence. He would be comfortable, but never truly free from family control. Victoria's expression showed barely concealed satisfaction at this arrangement. As the effective head of the family following Harrison's death, she would have significant influence over David's financial decisions and, by extension, his life choices. The message was clear. David's inheritance came with strings attached that would ensure his continued dependence on family approval. Margaret whispered to Thomas, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by those nearby. I suppose Father wanted to make sure David couldn't squander everything on his little art projects. At least this way the money will be protected from poor decisions. The comment was delivered with a smile, but Elena heard the condescension clearly. Margaret had never missed an opportunity to remind David that his artistic pursuits were viewed as frivolous hobbies rather than legitimate career choices. Charles nodded approvingly at the trust structure. It's a wise arrangement, he said. David will have security, but the family can ensure the funds are used appropriately. Father always did think of everything. Elena noticed that no one asked David how he felt about having his inheritance managed by his siblings. The assumption that he should be grateful for any bequest, regardless of the conditions attached, was taken for granted by everyone in the room except David himself. Blackwood set aside the documents he had been reading and reached for another set of papers. Now, he said, his tone becoming slightly more formal, we come to the matter of additional provisions and special circumstances that Harrison wanted addressed before we proceed to the final sections of his will. The phrase special circumstances seemed to catch everyone's attention. Victoria looked up from her quiet celebration, and Charles stopped calculating numbers on his phone. Even Margaret focused her attention back on the attorney instead of continuing her whispered commentary. Harrison was very specific that these additional matters be presented in a particular order and with appropriate context, Blackwood continued. He believed that understanding the full scope of his estate planning required knowledge of certain arrangements that may not have been apparent to all family members. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly, as something in the attorney's manner suggested they were approaching territory that none of the family members had anticipated. The confident satisfaction that had filled the room during the major bequests began to shift into something more cautious and uncertain. Charles was the first to voice what others were probably thinking. Additional provisions? Father was always thorough in his planning. But is there something significant we should know about? Blackwood's smile was enigmatic as he organized his papers with deliberate care. Harrison's estate planning was indeed comprehensive, Charles. More comprehensive than perhaps any of you realized. He believed very strongly that all relevant information should be presented before we address the final and most substantial portions of his will. The word substantial hung in the air with unexpected weight. Elena found herself leaning forward slightly, her attention sharpening as the attorney's manner suggested that everything they had heard so far, impressive as it had been, was merely preliminary to something far more significant. Around the table, the Whitmore siblings exchanged glances that mixed anticipation with the first hints of confusion. They had received substantial inheritances that matched their expectations and confirmed their positions within the family hierarchy. What could be more substantial than what had already been distributed? Victoria spoke for the group, her voice carrying a note of authority that suggested she expected to remain in control of whatever revelations were to come. Jonathan, we appreciate Father's attention to detail, but perhaps you could help us understand what these additional provisions might involve. Blackwood looked around the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Elena before returning to the family members seated at the main table. The additional provisions relate to the disposition of Harrison's business interests, which represent by far the largest portion of his estate. However, before we can address those matters, there are certain relationships and arrangements that must be properly explained and acknowledged. Elena felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach as she began to understand that whatever was coming next would change everything. The satisfied expressions around the table suggested that none of the family members had any idea what Harrison had actually planned for this moment. The game was about to shift into an entirely different phase, and Elena had the growing certainty that she was about to move from observer to center stage in ways that would shock everyone in the room, including herself. Jonathan Blackwood reached for the thickest set of documents yet, bound in burgundy leather with gold lettering that read Whitmore Industries Corporate Holdings. Elena recognized the folder from glimpses she had caught during her few visits to Harrison's study, though she had never been permitted to examine its contents directly. The room's energy shifted noticeably as family members realized they were about to learn the disposition of the business empire that had generated the wealth they had just inherited. Whitmore Industries encompassed dozens of companies across multiple sectors, from manufacturing and real estate to technology startups and international shipping operations. "We now address the matter of Harrison's business interests," Blackwood began, his voice taking on additional gravity. "These holdings represent the largest portion of the estate and required the most careful consideration in terms of structure and management succession." Victoria leaned forward with renewed intensity, her earlier satisfaction now replaced by sharp focus. As the family member who had been most involved in business discussions with Harrison, she clearly expected to receive a controlling position in the corporate structure. Charles positioned himself to take notes, his financial background making him the obvious candidate for managing the investment and acquisition strategies that had built the Whitmore fortune over 3 decades. Margaret sat straighter in her chair, perhaps anticipating a role that would leverage her social connections for business development. "The Whitmore Industries portfolio," Blackwood continued, "includes 47 separate corporate entities with combined assets valued at approximately $230 million. Harrison structured these holdings to ensure both operational continuity and family involvement across multiple generations." The numbers sent a visible ripple of excitement through the room. Even Elena, who had suspected the family wealth was substantial, was surprised by the sheer magnitude of the business empire Harrison had built. $230 million represented generational wealth on a scale that could fund charitable foundations and political campaigns. To Victoria Whitmore Sterling, Blackwood read from the carefully prepared document, "I hereby bequeath a 20% ownership stake in Whitmore Industries, along with the position of Vice President for Strategic Development and a seat on the board of directors." 20% was substantial, worth approximately $46 million, but Elena noticed the slight tightening around Victoria's eyes. As the eldest daughter and Harrison's most trusted advisor on family matters, Victoria had clearly expected a larger stake, possibly even majority control of the family business. To Charles Mitchell Whitmore, "I bequeath a 20% ownership stake in Whitmore Industries, along with the position of Chief Financial Officer and Chairman of the Investment Committee." Charles nodded approvingly, though Elena detected a similar flash of surprise at receiving exactly the same percentage as his older sister. The CFO position would give him significant operational control, but 20% ownership meant he would need to build coalitions with other family members for any major strategic decisions. To Margaret Whitmore Cross, "I bequeath a 15% ownership stake in Whitmore Industries, along with the position of Vice President for External Relations and responsibility for all charitable foundation activities." Margaret's 15% was still worth over $34 million, but the smaller percentage clearly reflected Harrison's assessment of her contributions to family business interests. Her role would focus on the social and philanthropic activities that matched her talents, while keeping her involved in corporate governance. The family members exchanged glances as they processed these allocations. Together, Victoria, Charles, and Margaret controlled 55% of the business empire, a majority stake that would allow them to maintain family control while sharing decision-making responsibilities. However, Elena noticed that 45% of the company remained unaccounted for, and David had not yet been mentioned in the business distributions. The arithmetic was straightforward, but something in Blackwood's manner suggested the calculations were more complicated than simple family division. To David Harrison Whitmore, Blackwood continued, "I bequeath a 5% ownership stake in Whitmore Industries, to be held in conjunction with his previously mentioned trust arrangement, along with the honorary title of Director of Cultural Initiatives." David's 5% was worth over $11 million, a substantial amount that would provide him with significant income from business operations. However, the honorary nature of his title and the small ownership percentage made clear his peripheral role in actual business management. Elena quickly calculated the ownership percentages in her head. Victoria, Charles, Margaret, and David together controlled 60% of Whitmore Industries, leaving 40% still unallocated. The missing portion was too large to be explained by charitable bequests or employee profit-sharing arrangements. Charles was apparently making similar calculations, because he looked up from his notes with a puzzled expression. "Jonathan, that accounts for 60% of the business holdings. Could you clarify how the remaining 40% will be distributed?" Blackwood set down the corporate documents and reached for the sealed envelope Elena had noticed earlier, the one marked with red wax and kept separate from all the other materials. His movement was deliberate, and Elena noticed that his hands were completely steady despite the gravity of whatever he was about to reveal. The remaining 40%, plus operational control of Whitmore Industries, brings us to the most significant provision of Harrison's estate planning. This bequest required extensive legal preparation and reflects decisions Harrison made after careful consideration of family dynamics and business requirements. Operational control caught everyone's attention immediately. The family members had received substantial ownership stakes, but none had been granted the authority to actually run the business empire. In corporate terms, ownership without control meant profit participation without decision-making power. Victoria's composure finally showed cracks as she realized the implications. Father retained control? But how is that possible? He appointed us to executive positions. But who has the authority to make strategic decisions for the company? Blackwood's expression was grave as he broke the seal on the special envelope, removing documents that appeared different from everything they had seen so far. These papers were printed on heavier stock and bore official corporate seals and notarization marks that suggested extraordinary legal preparation. Harrison was very specific about the transition of operational authority, he said. He believed that successful management of Whitmore Industries required not only family involvement, but also proven business competence and demonstrated loyalty to the company's long-term interests. The phrase proven business competence seemed to hang in the air with ominous implications. Elena felt something cold settling in her stomach as she began to understand that Harrison's estate planning had included considerations none of them had anticipated. Margaret spoke up, her voice carrying the first note of genuine concern they had heard from her all day. "Jonathan, surely Father discussed his succession planning with the family. Victoria has been working with him for years on strategic initiatives." Charles nodded in agreement. "We've all been involved in various aspects of the business operations. Father knew our capabilities and our commitment to preserving family wealth." Blackwood looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each family member before settling on Elena for a moment longer than seemed coincidental. "Harrison did indeed have extensive knowledge of everyone's capabilities," he said carefully. "That knowledge informed every aspect of his final decisions." The tension in the room was now palpable. What had begun as a satisfying distribution of substantial inheritances was turning into something none of them had expected. Elena noticed that David was gripping the arms of his chair, apparently sensing that whatever was coming would affect him as much as his siblings. Victoria attempted to regain control of the situation with her most authoritative tone. "Jonathan, I think we need clarity on this succession issue. The family has business obligations and board meetings scheduled. We cannot operate in uncertainty about management authority." Blackwood nodded gravely. "You are absolutely correct, Victoria." Operational clarity was Harrison's primary concern when he structured these final provisions. He wanted to ensure that everyone understood exactly who would have decision-making authority for Whitmore Industries. He lifted the first document from the special envelope, and Elena noticed that his hands were completely steady despite the obvious gravity of whatever he was about to read. The document bore an official corporate seal and multiple signature lines that suggested extensive legal preparation. The remaining 40% ownership stake in Whitmore Industries, along with voting control and operational authority as chief executive officer and chairman of the board of directors, Blackwood read in his measured tone, "I hereby bequeath to Elena Catherine Vasquez." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling vents. Every face in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror as the implications of what they had just heard began to sink in. "Elena Catherine Vasquez," Blackwood repeated, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Would you please rise?" Elena rose from her chair with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout 15 years of family gatherings. but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. The woman who had spent the morning being ignored and dismissed now commanded the attention of every person in the room through sheer force of the revelation they had just heard. Victoria was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. There must be some mistake. Elena is not even family. She has no business experience, no knowledge of our operations. Jonathan Blackwood's expression remained perfectly composed as he consulted his documents. There is no mistake, Victoria. Harrison's instructions were very clear and legally binding. Elena Catherine Vasquez is indeed the designated Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board for all Whitmore Industries operations. Charles struggled to process what he was hearing, his analytical mind rejecting information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about family dynamics and business succession. This is impossible. Father would never put someone without qualifications in charge of a $200 million enterprise. Blackwood reached into his briefcase and withdrew another thick folder, this one marked with Elena's full name and Harrison's distinctive handwriting. Perhaps this would be an appropriate time to share some additional context that Harrison felt was essential for your understanding of his decision. Elena remained standing, her hands clasped calmly in front of her as she watched the faces around the table cycle through confusion, disbelief, and the first stirrings of genuine panic. David stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his mouth slightly open in shock. Harrison asked me to read this personal letter he prepared specifically for this moment, Blackwood continued, unfolding several pages of letterhead bearing the Whitmore Industries logo. The letter is dated just 6 weeks before his death and represents his final thoughts on family relationships and business succession. He cleared his throat and began reading in Harrison's own words, as transcribed during their final meeting. To my family, gathered to hear my final wishes, I hope you will forgive the unconventional nature of this bequest, but I believe explanation is necessary for understanding my reasoning. The room was so quiet that Elena could hear Patricia's rapid breathing from across the table. Margaret had gone completely pale, her earlier satisfaction replaced by something approaching horror as she began to grasp the implications of what was unfolding. Elena Vasquez has been my secret business advisor and strategic consultant for the past 12 years, Blackwood read, his voice carrying Harrison's words across the stunned silence. What none of you knew is that Elena holds advanced degrees from Wharton School of Business, including an MBA in corporate strategy and a master's degree in international finance. The revelation hit the family like a physical blow. Elena watched Charles actually recoil in his chair, his face flushing as he processed the fact that the woman he had dismissed as an uneducated outsider possessed qualifications that exceeded his own business education. Furthermore, Harrison's letter continued through Blackwood's steady narration. Elena has been instrumental in developing the strategic plans that grew Whitmore Industries from a regional operation into the international conglomerate it is today. Her analysis and recommendations guided our expansion into emerging markets and our successful diversification into technology sectors. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. That's impossible. I worked directly with Father on all major strategic initiatives. I would have known if someone else was involved in planning. Blackwood paused in his reading to address Victoria directly. Harrison was very deliberate about compartmentalizing his advisory relationships. Elena's contributions were made through private consultations and detailed reports that Harrison presented as his own analysis during family business discussions. Elena spoke for the first time since entering the law firm, her voice carrying a quiet authority that none of them had ever heard before. I recommended the acquisition of Morrison Technologies 3 years ago. I developed the 5-year expansion plan for the shipping division. I identified the tax advantages that saved the company $18 million through overseas restructuring. The family stared at her in shock as she calmly recounted strategic decisions they had credited to Harrison's business genius. Each revelation struck them like a separate blow, undermining everything they thought they understood about their father's capabilities and their own roles in the family business. Charles found his voice, though it came out strangled. Why would Father hide your involvement? Why let us believe he was developing these strategies independently? Elena's smile was enigmatic as she looked around the table at faces that had shown her nothing but condescension for over a decade. Your father wanted to observe how the family treated someone they perceived as powerless. He believed that character revealed under those circumstances would predict behavior when real authority was at stake. The implications of her words hit the family with devastating clarity. Harrison had not simply been building a business empire. He had been conducting a 15-year character assessment of his own children, using Elena as an unwitting test case for their fundamental decency and capacity for leadership. Blackwood resumed reading from Harrison's letter, his voice carrying the dead man's final judgment on his family. I have watched for years as my children treated Elena with casual cruelty, dismissing her intelligence, mocking her background, and assuming her silence indicated acceptance of their superiority. Margaret's hands were trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. We didn't know. How could we have known she was qualified? She never said anything. Elena's expression remained calm, but her voice carried steel when she responded. I said nothing because your father asked me to remain silent. He wanted to see who you really were when you thought there were no consequences for your behavior. The weight of years of casual dismissals and condescending remarks settled over the family like a suffocating blanket. Every cutting comment, every assumption about Elena's capabilities, every moment they had treated her as invisible help now stood revealed as evidence of their character defects. Harrison's letter continued through Blackwood's narration. Elena demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and genuine concern for family welfare even while being treated as an outsider. She provided business advice that generated hundreds of millions in value while never seeking recognition or demanding compensation beyond our private consulting agreement. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a stunned whisper. Elena, why didn't you tell me? I'm your husband. I should have known about your education, your work with father. Elena turned to look at David with something that might have been sympathy. Your father insisted on complete confidentiality. He wanted to see if you would support me without knowing about my qualifications or contributions. He wanted to know if you would defend me simply because I was your wife and because it was right. The accusation hung in the air with devastating clarity. David had failed the test as completely as his siblings, choosing to go along with family dynamics rather than defending his wife against their casual cruelty. Victoria made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Even if this is all true, Elena lacks the family connections necessary to maintain our business relationships. The board members and major clients expect Whitmore family leadership. Blackwood consulted his documents again. Harrison anticipated that concern as well. Elena has been attending board meetings for the past 2 years, participating by video conference under the name Catherine Mitchell. The board members know her voice and have approved every major initiative she has proposed. The final revelation was too much for the family to process. Not only had Elena been secretly advising Harrison, not only did she possess superior qualifications, but she had been actively managing the business operations they thought they understood while remaining completely invisible to their awareness. Elena looked around the table at the faces of people who had spent 15 years ensuring she knew her place in their hierarchy. The woman who had arrived that morning as David's dismissed wife now stood before them as their employer, their superior, and their judge. The transformation was complete, and Elena Catherine Vasquez had not even begun to exercise the authority Harrison had granted her. Elena remained standing as the weight of Harrison's final revelations settled over the conference room like a judgment that could not be appealed. The silence stretched until Victoria finally gathered enough composure to mount what appeared to be a final desperate challenge to the new reality. Elena, I hope you understand that business relationships require years to develop. Our clients and partners expect continuity and family leadership. Surely we can work together to ensure a smooth transition while maintaining established protocols. Elena's response was delivered in a voice none of them had ever heard from her before, calm and authoritative with an undertone that suggested years of suppressed observations finally finding expression. Victoria, your executive position is subject to board approval, which now requires my recommendation. I will be reviewing all family employment arrangements over the next 60 days. The implications hit the family immediately. Their executive titles, company benefits, and access to corporate resources were no longer guaranteed birthright privileges, but employment opportunities subject to Elena's discretion. The power dynamic had not simply shifted, it had completely inverted. Charles attempted a more conciliatory approach, his financial background making him acutely aware of what corporate control actually meant in practical terms. Elena, we may have had our differences in the past, but we are still family. Surely we can move forward professionally while maintaining family relationships. Elena turned her attention to Charles with an expression of polite interest that somehow managed to be more devastating than open hostility. Charles, your CFO appointment was provisional pending my approval. Given your track record of financial decision-making, I will need to conduct a comprehensive audit before confirming any executive positions. She opened a leather portfolio that none of them had noticed her carrying and withdrew a thick folder of documents. I have been documenting family interactions and business discussions for the past 12 years at your father's request. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about my capabilities, every demonstration of character has been recorded and witnessed. The folder represented a comprehensive record of their behavior when they believed there were no consequences for their actions. Elena had not simply endured their treatment. She had been methodically documenting it as evidence of their fitness for leadership responsibilities. Margaret made one final attempt at damage control, her social skills deployed in service of family preservation. Elena, dear, if we said things that hurt your feelings, surely you understand that family dynamics can be complicated. We never meant anything personally harmful. Elena's smile was polite but utterly without warmth as she responded to the woman who had spent years making cutting remarks about knowing one's place. Margaret, your position as Vice President for External Relations involves representing the company to charitable organizations and community leaders. I will be evaluating whether your demonstrated interpersonal skills align with our corporate values. David sat frozen in his chair, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time in 15 years of marriage. The woman he had thought he was protecting through passive acceptance of family dynamics had never needed his protection. She had been building the empire that supported their lifestyle, while he worried about disappointing relatives who had already written him off as a failure. Elena, he said quietly, his voice barely audible in the tense silence. I don't know what to say. I should have defended you. I should have stood up to them regardless of what I thought I knew. Elena looked at her husband with something that might have been sadness mixed with disappointment. David, your father hoped you would support me because it was right, not because I had credentials. Your trust fund will continue, but your involvement in business operations will depend on your ability to demonstrate backbone when it matters. Jonathan Blackwood began organizing his documents, clearly preparing to conclude the formal proceedings. Elena, you will need to schedule meetings with the corporate attorneys to finalize the transition documents and establish your authority with the board of directors. Elena nodded professionally. I have already scheduled those meetings, Jonathan. The transition will be effective immediately, and I will be implementing new operational protocols beginning Monday morning. Her preparedness for this moment revealed the extent to which she had anticipated and planned for this day. Elena had not simply inherited control of the business. She had been ready to assume that control with comprehensive knowledge of every aspect of the operation. Victoria made one final attempt to salvage some semblance of family unity. Elena, regardless of business matters, I hope we can maintain family relationships. Perhaps we could discuss these changes privately before implementing anything drastic. Elena's response was delivered with professional courtesy that carried no hint of personal warmth. Victoria, all business communications will be conducted through proper corporate channels. Family social functions will continue as scheduled, and I expect professional behavior from all family members during business interactions. The message was clear. Elena would maintain the forms of family relationship, but the casual intimacy that had allowed years of condescending treatment was permanently ended. They would interact as employer and employees, with all the formal boundaries that relationship required. As the family began gathering their belongings in stunned silence, Elena remained composed while internally processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The woman who had arrived that morning as an overlooked in-law was leaving as the head of a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Blackwood's assistant approached Elena with a business card and a quiet comment about scheduling follow-up appointments. The deference in her manner made it clear that word of the transition had already begun spreading through the law firm's staff. As Elena walked toward the conference room door, her heels clicked with the same authority that Victoria had displayed upon entering that morning. The family followed behind her in a subdued procession, their earlier confidence replaced by the bewilderment of people whose entire world had shifted beneath their feet. David caught up with Elena in the elevator, his expression showing a mixture of awe and apprehension. "How did you do it? How did you manage to hide all of this for so many years?" Elena looked at her husband with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused child. "I didn't hide anything, David. I simply allowed your family to see what they expected to see while I built relationships based on competence rather than assumptions." The elevator reached the lobby, and Elena walked toward the exit with the confident stride of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Behind her, the Whitmore family struggled to process the reality that their comfortable assumptions about power, privilege, and family hierarchy had been permanently shattered. As Elena stepped into the afternoon sunlight, her phone buzzed with messages from board members and business partners who had apparently already received notification of the leadership transition. The efficiency of the communication suggested that Harrison had planned every aspect of this transfer with the same attention to detail that had built the business empire. Elena Catherine Vasquez had spent 15 years being invisible while quietly building the foundation for this moment. Now she would spend the coming years demonstrating exactly what she was capable of when her intelligence was finally acknowledged and her authority was unquestioned. What did you think of Elena's incredible transformation from dismissed daughter-in-law to business empire leader? Have you ever witnessed someone completely surprise everyone by revealing capabilities no one knew they possessed? The way people treat others when they think there are no consequences really does reveal their true character. Share your thoughts about Elena's patience and strategic planning in the comments below, and let me know if you have ever been underestimated by people who should have known better.